actually raises the number of established marine invasive species in Hawaii to more than 375 species. Dr. Carlton's research focuses on the environmental history of coastal marine ecosystems, including species invasions and extinctions. His research sites span from the Galapagos Islands, Chile, Hawaii, Pacific coast of the US, and of course, New England, his home. Dr. Carlton is the founding editor-in-chief for the journal Biological Invasions. Those of us that work on invasive species frequently use that journal, so mahalo for that. And he is also a Pew Fellow for Marine Conservation and a recipient of the Fellows Medal from the California Academy of Science. I also have to say, just a quick editorial ad, as I'm doing research for some of the things I write, including on ballast water and other marine invasive species, it's Dr. Carlton that's the lead author going back on those, or somewhere in the author mix. So it's an honor and a pleasure to have you talking with us today. Oh, yes, we have some greetings to you from Marshall Islands. Mahalo. That reminds me, for folks joining us, we are streaming live to the HISC YouTube channel, where hopefully this is being recorded and we'll be able to revisit it later. There are a number of people that are out actively in the field and they wanted to make sure that they could watch this. We'll send that link around afterwards. And for those of you, as we're going through Dr. Carlton's presentation, if you have questions, you can go ahead and type it either into the chat. I don't see a Q&A function, but regardless of where you type it in, we hope to have a little bit of time at the end where we can ask and engage directly with Dr. Carlton on some of your questions. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Jim. Mahalo.
Aloha, and thank you very much, Christy. Good afternoon, everyone out there in the world, across the globe. What I'd like to do is tell to you a little bit about the marine aquarium vector, but what I want to do is actually spend more time setting that vector into the bigger picture of invasions and the bigger picture of vectors. So we're going to start with a basic definition and a preamble, again, to try to embed why the aquarium vector is of interest to us, why it is of interest going forward, and how it, again, fits into the big picture. Biological invasions, also called bioinvasions, means the process of a species arriving by any vector and establishing reproducing populations in a region where it did not exist in historical time. And this often involves transgressing one barrier or another, usually physical or climatic, often across the ocean. In essence, the core idea is the addition of a novel species to a community, seemingly simple. A common alternative definition is that invasions are those species found outside of their native range. The challenge with this is that for a staggering number of species, we do not know their natural range boundaries. And that's because behind what we describe as the natural range are centuries, in some cases millennia, of the potential human-mediated movement of species. We often look at the textbook, a paper, a book, to look up the so-called native range of a species. That range is typically repeated over and over again, often for decades, when in fact it may in reality not be known. Let's frame it this way. In the absence of fossil evidence, archaeological evidence, historic, genetic, or other evidence, species ranges as we determine them after the potential for human-mediated dispersal began. In many areas, starting in the 1500s, and other areas much earlier, cannot assume to be natural. That leaves us with asking on a regular basis the often difficult and frustrating question, how do we know that's the natural range of a species? And I want to set that as an important foundation as we go on. A key part of that definition was by any vector, by any means. And what I want to do is just very briefly walk you through a little bit of the history of this definition. More than 100 years ago, 1921, Braun by the mid-20th century, Carl Lindroth, a famous Swedish entomologist, Dan Simberloff, described the natural process of historical plant movements, the natural arrival on Iceland of various insect species, and the experimental colonization of mangrove islands as invasions. Critically, Chapter 2 of perhaps the most famous book on invasions, Charles Elton's 1957, The Ecology of Invasions by Animals and Plants, is devoted to natural range expansions under the title, of course, of invasions. MacArthur and Wilson, two of our senior ecologists, described the fundamental process of biogeography as dispersal, invasions, competition, adaptation, and extinction. Williamson, a British invasion biologist, wrote that biological invasions happen when an organism, any sort of organism, arrives somewhere beyond its previous range. There's that problem with the range. Invasions have been an important component of the evolutionary process throughout geological history, and Gerrit Vermeer emphasized that by invasion, I mean the geographical expansion of a species into an area not previously occupied by that species. Invasions may occur as a result of climatic and tectonic changes, as well as through introduction by humans. Why am I belaboring these definitions? Because about 20 years ago, the definition changed. The definition of invasion became restricted originally to so-called alien floras to, and I quote, where the distribution and abundance of plant changes as a result of human activity. And this definition gained broad subscription in the years and decades to follow in much of the general invasion literature. In essence, the definition of invasions, long defined as focusing on the fundamental process of adding a species to a community, changed to a focus on how the species got there, changed to a focus on the vector. But in fact, anchored by the longstanding definitions across many disciplines, geology, ecology, environmental science, and particularly because of the vast number of species now moving because of human-mediated climate change, biological invasions are now seen to include both human-mediated introductions and range expansions. And we detail that in a recent paper in Biological Invasions. It's a rather long read, but we try to present that argument in some detail. That leads us to a definition of introduced species, which is very much like the overall definition of invasions, transported by human activity across continental ocean barriers, with a long list of synonyms. We often list these for students because when students go looking online for literature on invasions, they may inadvertently leave out a lot of these words and miss a large amount of literature. And what I've noticed recently is that a lot of literature no longer appears prior to the mid-1990s, when the word invasion was not used very much in the general literature, and the most common word were things like non-indigenous, alien, or exotic. So some recent reviews leave out a lot of early literature simply because not picked up by the word invasion. We want to emphasize that introductions are not speeding up what would happen anyway. It's not a rate function. We can move virtually any species anywhere in the world in 24 hours, and that has no precedent in Earth history. And we're going to get back to that phenomenon in a few minutes. Another, in a sort of foundation setting, for how long is a species still considered introduced after it has arrived? That's a very common question in invasion discussions. The basic framework is, in an ecological and evolutionary framework, that older movements are still considered introductions. There are no fixed before and after dates. There's not a line in the water or the sand. But introduction of dingoes to Australia by humans thousands of years ago, the plants and animals introduced to Britain by the Romans, species brought by the Polynesians to the Hawaiian Islands, are all still considered as introduced species. Range expansions, which are often now not captured in much literature, especially out of Europe, as invasions, are the movements of species often along corridors, also where they're previously absent, involve native species or older introductions that are now responding to environmental changes, particularly climate change, and recent introductions that are expanding to their natural physiological limits. Those species may move by natural vectors or by anthropogenic vectors such as ships. But curiously, a lot of the recent range expansion literature simply says that these species are moving by ocean currents. But the default is not natural vectors. The default may be that if natural vectors and shipping can play a role, then we don't know what the vector is. A particular point of view here is that species have long been moved, for example, by ships, to regions in higher latitudes where it was historically too cold for colonization. Species moving, for example, along the Atlantic corridor of North America, from Florida or the Carolinas up into New England or Nova Scotia. For centuries, it's too cold up north. Now these regions are warming and are available for colonization. The default in the literature is to say these are moving by ocean currents, but of course, many of them could be moving by ships as well, as they have always been transported for a long time. The bottom line here is that range expansions may be introductions. In this case, the concepts overlap and they are not in conflict. Regardless of whether invasions are introductions or range expansions or both, from an ecological and evolutionary biology point of view, as I've hinted at before, the interest is in how a community responds to the arrival of a novel species relative to how resident species change. Those resident species may have been prior introductions, changing abundance and diversity, distribution, interactions, functional groups. From a public government and environmental management point of view, the question may be very different. How invasions do or will impact ecosystem services, cultural and social values, the economy, public health, rare and endangered species, how invasions are framed in terms of pre-invasion and post-invasion management. These two are not in conflict. These are both critical areas of interest and they overlap extensively. What I want to do for a couple of additional minutes is put invasions in even a broader framework in a global sense, get an expansive view here. These, as many of you know who are on this webinar, are some of the great drivers of ocean change in the last few hundred years. Where they have an impact varies over time and space. This is not in order of the most important to the least important. Think of them as arranged on a horizontal line, not a vertical framework. But our interest here in terms of biological invasions and in the ocean particularly is how the first four of these drivers would interact with species invasions. I want to walk you through this a little bit in order to understand some of the complexities and where I think we should go on this. Fisheries operations, and of course, any one of these drivers is an hour webinar, are over extraction, bottom trawling, seafloor impact, and so on. Over extraction means removal of predators and competitors. Fisheries operations can create highly disturbed habitat. Aquaculture facilities create new habitat, artificial surfaces, and can cause the release of non-native species. Lost and derelict nets can mean species transported on or with the drifting nets. Water quality, water pollution, very broad term for, of course, thousands of different chemicals additions, includes eutrophication and the impacts on plankton, loss of oxygen, can create also highly altered habitats, potentially decimate or extirpate native predators and competitors, opening up opportunities for invasions. Here we have potential opportunities for non-native phytoplankton by disturbance of the water column. Altering physical habitat, of course, altering the shoreline, what were previously salt marshes, mudflats, and estuary and river channels to become, in a modern sense, ports, harbors, and marinas. Very, very common. There we go. Sorry. Removal of vast areas of natural habitats as a result of conversion of habitat. Often the previous communities are gone. Again, removal of native predators and competitors, all of which provide opportunities for invasions. Ports, harbors, and marinas, classic areas for artificial habitats and disturbed environments. And of course, introduction of species in those areas through multiple vectors. Climate change, multiple webinars on this, but the classic list of warming temperatures, polar sea ice, sea level rise, changing ocean chemistry and ocean currents. Again, highly altered habitats, creation of new habitat, changing ocean chemistry. And as I emphasized, previous cold regions are becoming warmer, facilitating poleward invasion of lower latitude, essentially warm affinity species. And in conjunction with that, the decrease in cold affinity native predators and competitors. So what does that look like? It looks like this. It looks like there's deep connections between all of these drivers of ocean change. But as all of you know as well, these are often studied as if they were silos. And it requires a huge amount of expertise to work within any one of these areas, and a huge amount of expertise to work within these silos, to the point that some of this work, of course, is species specific. There is no expert on fisheries. It's often species specific. There's no expert on climate change. You might be an expert on altered ocean chemistry or sea level rise, and the same with all the other bins here. If we import those implications of what it would mean for interactions with invasions, then and overlay those, then that network begins to look like this, where there is a vast interaction between these, but extremely difficult to grasp, and because we want to work through all of those silos. The bottom line here, and the message I want to send, is that we need an increasingly broad approach to understand the complex web of interactions, because these often open up new invasion windows for non-native species, and that's fundamental to our being able to predict new invasions and their potential impact. Put another way, when invasions arrive, we often don't know exactly why now. We may be able to figure out the vector, but if the vector has been in place for decades or centuries, the question is, why do species that could well have been introduced long ago suddenly appear? And the answer seems to be somewhere in this matrix. That was the preamble, and a long one, but it gets us to, how do new invasions arrive due to human activities? And here's where I want to set the aquarium, the modern day aquarium industry into perspective. A primary vector that we've recognized for a long time is biofouling on ships, species attached to the hulls of ships and many other crevices and areas not directly on the hull. Ballast water was recognized as a vector well over 100 years ago, but only came to really serious attention at the very end of the 20th century, starting around 1990 and later. So our interest in ballast water, although in play since the 19th century, has been relatively recently. Historically, vessel-related vectors were huge in terms of, we think, vastly more fouling on ships' hulls when ships were slower and had long port residency to gather species and to drop species off. When there was solid ballast before there was water ballast, and the history of ballast is for centuries, rocks and sand and shore debris, much longer than the history of ballast water. And when there were wooden ships, not just wood-boring species that were distributed around the world, but species that lived in the crevices and the tunnels created by those species. It was a very, very busy ship bottom for centuries. again, long before ballast water, and again, ballast water fairly relatively recently. Still, with all of that, these are unintentional vectors. They are both ballast water and biofouling are under varying levels of regulatory policy, control, and management. The best we can say is varying levels without launching into another webinar in terms of what does that mean. But internationally, nationally, and locally, each of these have been managed in some way or are being looked at in some way. These vectors have not stopped. Ballast water with species is still being moved around the world. We think not at the rate or scale it was in the last 20 or 30 years. Biofouling still very much in play as well. But these are unintentional vectors, we think, generally, and great deal of emerging interest on how to control them as the future decades. At the international level, one big effort is called globalist, and another is called glofouling for global. Aquaculture and mariculture have played a serious role in moving species all over the world for a long, long time. In the early days, it wasn't called aquaculture or mariculture, but we were moving oysters around for a long time. And the earliest oyster introductions that appear to be intentional were in the 1500s from Asia to Europe. A long and deep history. Today, we think of them as aquaculture, mariculture, which is global, as being related to invasions largely through accidental escapes. Adults are larvae, and of course, associated epibionts and endobionts if you're an oyster or a mussel, not just the target species, but what might be on or in that target species. Again, these are unintentional vectors. Historically, in the mariculture, aquaculture world, species were outplanted into the world to be deliberately introduced. But today we think of them as largely unintentional, again, under varying levels of regulatory management. Finally, ocean rafting is an increasingly recognized mechanism, only in the last decade or so prominently. Working in Hawaii, we know, of course, of the Japanese tsunami debris that originated with the earthquake and tsunami in March 11, 2011, and that debris field then came across the Pacific and lasted for well over 12 years, moving species, hundreds of species, to North America and Hawaii. Ocean rafting is it means species associated with marine debris and litter. We're just beginning to get a handle of on this on a global basis. It is also unintentional. It's increasing. We think shipping and aquaculture mediated vectors, we hope, are decreasing. But fundamental to this is that we hope is a significant reduction in the input of plastic marine debris into the oceans. That reduction is not happening at this time. But underlying this going forward is a hope to mediate this mechanism, is to decrease the amount of debris that's out there that can be a vector for species in ways that have no real precedent. That brings us to an entirely different world of intentional releases. The others framed as unintentional and hopefully under various management scenarios or hoped for management scenarios. And those intentional releases are the embedded, potentially intentional releases in the intentional movement of live animals and plants. They come in a variety of categories. These are the major mechanisms. There are others, but home aquaria or public aquaria, the live bait industry, live imported seafood, and fisheries enhancement. Associated with all of this, as before, are many, many species, sometimes hundreds of associated species of endobionts and epibionts that we often don't see in the record because of just not being cataloged as what's with the species. I'll talk about that in a minute. as well. This particular vector or group of vectors is designed for quick and easy purchase online, the BioWeb, we now call it, rapid airborne movement in order to maximize keeping species alive, and for the first three, aquarium, bait, and imported seafood, direct placement into the hands of the public with a difficulty knowing what happens after that. Let me say a word about fisheries enhancement, which again, like aspects of shipping, have a long, long history. In the 19th century and well into the 20th century, moving live species around was the thing to do. This has an amazing history of called acclimatization societies. State and federal governments were deeply involved in sprinkling species, freshwater and marine and terrestrial, across the globe. It begins in the 18th century, but spins up in the 19th century and surprisingly goes deep into the 20th century. And this is part of a very long era before there were supported concerns. I say supported because there were concerns, but they were not supported by those in charge of moving species about the many potential impacts of such releases. This was in an era of improving nature, of augmenting nature, of going around the world and finding that there wasn't an edible oyster, or the oyster was not large enough, or the fish that you were used to having where you grew up was not where you now moved. And so a vast number of species were sprinkled around the world. Hawaii, for marine species, was not immune to this. There was a major first era from the 1890s to the 1930s where at least 10 species, marine species, were introduced deliberately to the islands. Red mangrove came from Florida, and buttonwood mangrove from Florida, we think, was some associated species. The manila clam was intentionally introduced from Japan. The mangrove crab from Samoa, Atlantic oysters via California into Oahu and other islands, and Pacific oysters from Japan. That was the first major era, and associated species we know or possibly came along with them. The second era, which lasted surprisingly long, involved moving 17 species that we know of fish and seaweed and releasing them in the islands. There's not enough paperwork today to write the environmental impact statement if we propose to introduce any of these species anywhere and frame what the outcome could be. But remember, we were at the tail end of an era, a long era from moving species around intentionally. And this era ended half a century ago, 50 years ago. With fisheries enhancement aside, that leaves us three major routes: the aquarium industry, the live bait industry, and imported seafood. As a sidebar, if we were to purchase these species online and they arrive in a box of seaweed or in water, or we get them through some other conduit, what might come along with them? I'm going to share with you a little bit of data for some work we did a few years ago, where we intentionally asked that question through some sea grant funding. We ordered bait worms from Maine. We ordered a live seafood dinner from Chesapeake Bay, the blue crab Callinectes, soft shell crab. We ordered a famous marsh plant called Spartina from Maryland, used in marsh restoration. And we ordered up 5 species of sea squirts, 5 specimens each, from a marine biological supply house in California. The shipping address was, in the program that I work in, was one of the houses in which students live. We didn't want the address to be a laboratory so that the purveyor of these would think they had to clean up the shipment or do something different. We wanted them to do exactly what they would do any case, in any time, sending stuff out when it was ordered. Our question was, what else is in the box when received? The bait worms arrived in a box of seaweed along with the worms, and we found 18 additional species in the box. The blue crabs, just adult blue crabs in a styrofoam box, when we washed them off, there were 12 additional species with the crabs. The Spartina arrived in saline soil bundles, and we found 10 species. We paid for, I think it was about $2 a piece, 5 specimens each for 5 species of sea squirts from Southern California. They arrived in a plastic bag full of seawater, and when we sorted things out, there were 104 species associated with that shipment, most of which we didn't pay for. Of these mechanisms, the bait and imported seafood industries are very much alive and working. They're strongly linked to certain invasions in other regions, but overall, relatively fewer species are in motion globally on a daily or weekly basis than the aquarium industry. We don't know a lot about the bait industry or the imported seafood industry on a global basis. Species in motion, what's with them along the way, and of course, again, their fate after being put into the hands of the public. Setting those aside, that leaves us with the aquarium industry. Having set aside and a cascade the other still active vectors. This has been a question of great interest for over 30 years. I suspect the literature goes back much further. It became a very popular question in the first 20 years of this century. Papers continue to come out trying to figure out what's in motion, how many species are involved, what are the vectors and pathways involved, and what happens when these species leave any kind of control and put into the public arena. So per the title of our webinar, what's the special nature of the aquarium vector? What sets it apart from all these other vectors that have moved species and continue to move species around the world? I suspect it's the most rapid vector in play today for a worldwide transport of a really significant number of species. Within 24 hours, ships do not move that fast, and is moving a large number of species in large numbers, but global numbers and global species lists appear to be elusive. For any one region, it may be very difficult to know what's arriving. And a fundamental axis of management is to know what's arriving, what's on the conveyor belt. It is probably the number one vector today for which the control, I can think about this for a moment, of the intentional release of non-native species is primarily in the hands of the public. And it's perhaps the lowest hanging fruit for aquarium owners to play a significant role as citizen scientists, as citizen stewards of the ocean environment, and not release their species into the open ocean or into habitats where they could become established. This vector is still active, still in play, and at this time, we will still see more invasions as a result of the aquarium vector. Underlying all this is that once established and widespread in the ocean, not in a controlled small lagoon or in the back part of a marina, no marine invader has yet ever been eradicated. Yet. And that brings us to the fundamental message for all vectors, which is the prevention is the primary strategy for invasion management. Otherwise, it's toothpaste out of the tube. Mahalo.
Wow, I don't know about you folks, but I'm just like writing notes like crazy, and I've got my camera taking pictures of the screen. So let's go ahead and see if we have any questions in the chat. Let's see, can we stop sharing so we can look at each other and I can see my chat screen? There we go. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Oh my gosh, that buildup was crazy. All right, let's look into let's look into the chat here.
I may have answered all possible questions. So
I don't think so. I have a few for you actually.
good.
You know, you work up nicely to the marine aquarium trade being the most pressing. Honestly, we haven't done enough to work to address this, and we're playing catch up on the technology. Are there some ways that we can hopefully try to address this pathway better for just with the United States in mind? I care about the world, but really,
Yeah.
how about the US?
Yeah, that's sort of a stratified question. Certainly in locally in the state of Hawaii, you can't release these things into the wild, but people do. We know this all the time. They also release live seafood for whatever reason into the wild. Sometimes they don't want to put it in the boiling pot. Sometimes they think, why should I continue to pay for this if I can establish a local population of my favorite seafood? But really fundamental is to know what's coming in and what the potential is for what's coming in. And that was really one of the great motivations for ballast water regulation, was because the plethora of species coming in was staggering. We had lots of studies about the species composition of ballast water. That was highly motivational to provide a regulatory framework. So if faced with a vector where there are potentially a lot of species that can be dropped by the public for one reason or another into the wild, it would be an early step would be to know what are we looking at in terms of potential species, even though it might be illegal to do so.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah, thank you. Let's we're going to ask to go a bit deeper, and maybe I can add a little bit of context as well. Stephanie Easley asks, are there any federal laws or rules that regulate the aquarium trade? And let's focus on prevention first.
Yeah,
I can chime in on some of that too. So you first.
So there are species that are not allowed to be moved for sure. They are on the ban list. Chinese mitten crabs in North America, in the U.S., and I think also in Canada. So it's a species specific. It goes back to something called the Lacey Act. But in general, a lot of stuff can come in if it is not on a list, and especially if it's marked as seafood. And there is where there's a lot of irony. And I'll give you a quick example, which is that if we were to propose to introduce the Chesapeake Bay blue crab that I mentioned to California, a large carnivorous crab, again, not enough paper in the world to write the environmental impact statement, and the proposal would be turned down. You can't do that. You just couldn't add a large carnivorous crab to San Francisco Bay. However, they cross the state borders, and you can buy them alive if you want in San Francisco and then throw them in the bay. So there's a management vacuum right there. So yes, a species specific level, but not at a broad level as far as I know.
Yeah, I'll go one step further. We had to do a lot of research on this. I sit as part of my other duties. I'm appointed to the Invasive Species Advisory Committee, which advises federal agencies, the National Invasive Species Council, et cetera. And we looked into this question because the federal government is really working hard on an early detection rapid response framework that is supposed to support and expand what the U.S. Department of Agriculture, APHIS, does already, right? They are looking at pests of agriculture and forestry. But there's all sorts of species outside of that, like marine aquarium species, that are not regulated and would not be prohibited for importation by that agency. And looking over at the Fish and Wildlife Service, they are ostensibly the lead. but their tools for actually preventing the importation are very limited. And so the Lacey Act being one of them, and we saw what happened when they tried to regulate the importation and interstate trade of some of the most harmful snakes out there in the pet trade. So I think that this is a really big issue and something we need to find a lead agency that is willing and able to protect us from this really emerging issue. So let's go to the chat again. The questions are now coming in, so I have to keep up. Clara Benedin says, how do researchers play a role in possible introductions via the aquarium industry? Thinking about possible release of study animals such as crabs. How and do researchers play a role?
Yeah, we would, thank you, good question. We would hope the researchers would not be among those who would release species into the wild. I'm sure it's happened intentionally or unintentionally when aquaria are tossed out or things have gone foul. Broader still, researchers have been implicated in moving species around. We have looked at in the last few years for the researchers who work across intertidal environments, salt marshes, mudflats, that there's a potentially large number of species moved in their boots. And we've done a number of studies intercepting what's on boots. And this is both terrestrial and marine. And it's a little overwhelming what can be transported in the treads of boots, especially boots that are preferred that have really deep treads. Like they're just great for moving through in field work. And there was a famous case some years ago where a lot of researchers from national estuarine sanctuaries across the United States convened at one particular sanctuary, and they brought all their field shoes with them to go on hikes in this particular sanctuary. The sanctuary manager asked if they could sample all their boots before they went walking, and they had soil and so on in them. And I think he grew out something like 25 species of plants from the soil on the boots of the estuary managers that were coming in. So there are other cases where we think that research equipment moved species from one place to another. And there's another famous case, and I won't belabor this because we could tell lots of stories, where in the search for the Loch Ness monster, a lot of underwater camera gear was taken from the Great Lakes to Loch Ness, which now is in possession of a viable population of a Great Lake flatworm, moved
Oh
over
man.
like cocoons. So
I tell you what, let's just have a webinar where you tell us stories, because that's like ridiculous. Thank you. I also put a resource into the chat for folks that are going to watch the YouTube stream. One resource that you can use if you're a researcher or doing control work, use the HACCP Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point Planning tool to think through your activities and figure out where your critical control points are, e.g. like bleaching your equipment or something. Moving on, and let's see, we've got Matt Bauer. Thanks for joining us in California there, Matt. Who are going to be the best partners in delivering this message to consumers? Two-part question. Are these going to be retail stores? Is this kind of the way we deal with the selling of potentially invasive plants being sold through home, garden and nursery stores? What's your thoughts on that?
yeah, certainly, and we know that a number of aquarium stores already participate in this, and by advising customers as to what they might do with the live animals and plants that they bought and what they should do with them when they're done with them. What's difficult where we lack the data is out the door. Once they leave, how many of those species are actually returned to the dealer if they're done with them? Do they go to schools for a school aquaria? What happens to those school aquaria? And so there is a growing campaign. My sense is that large sections of the aquarium industry are acutely aware of this, as they have been for decades. But there is a gap, and that gap is when we're really out there in the real world with the public, and they're for whatever reason, they are done with the thing that they have in their aquarium, and these releases continue. And the evidence in hand in Hawaii is that these releases continue today. So there is some kind of a messaging gap, a communication gap. It is it the strength of it? Is it the frequency of repetition? I'm not sure where it is, but the fact that the vector is alive and well tells us there's much more to do.
Yeah, appreciate that. I'll add my 2 cents on here. I think there's two competing issues. We're certainly seeing this in Hawaii. There's the people that, just don't want to kill what they have. They spent years and lots of money taking care of these things, and they take the Finding Nemo approach, right? All dumps lead to the ocean, so just outplanting them. The other folks that we're seeing are people that want to have monetary gain from some of these illegal species. And they take, for example, their corals and they place it on the reef and for later harvesting to sell on the black market. So I think there's two competing things here. And so when you have these two separate camps, you can't have the same messages, you can't have the same delivery methods. It's really hard to provide an outreach message to someone who's very comfortable doing something completely illegal. So being very cognizant that some people are doing it and can very not easily, but they can accept a message like don't let it loose. There's other people that 100% are very immune to any sort of method and message that we might have. All right, thanks. Oh, hey, Erin, thanks for joining. Half a day. Have you noticed any trends in the, whoa, you jumped, spread of Chetomorpha velardii? I probably mispronounced the species name.
Yeah, I'm not the good. I'm not a seaweed guy. This is a tropical green algae, but unless we have somebody on the webinar who works with that group, I don't know much about this species. I work on invertebrates, some algae, some fish, but I don't track this particular species.
Yeah, he did add another comment on Guam. Chetomorpha had a major bloom in 2012, and lifelong fishers report never having seen it before. Bloom seemed tied to ENSO, and gets so thick you can see it on Google Earth, which that's pretty thick.
Yeah. Interesting species to keep track of and to see whether or not it's going to get to the islands. Yeah.
All right. Well, I got your email. If I find any details, I'll let you know, Farron. Thanks for that. We are just about 10 minutes out from the end. So any last questions, go ahead and put them into the chat. If not, I'll pause for a moment and see if anything comes in.
Very good.
All right.
I'm happy to chat with anybody offline, off the webinar as well about any of the things I've mentioned. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yes, so we in Hawaii, we have launched a Don't Let It Loose Hawaii campaign. We did meet with the Stop AIS, which is the national group that has the Don't Let It Loose campaign. And folks recognize their logo with the snake and the reptiles and the amphibians. It's sort of this mottled mustard color. But we wanted to focus attention on the marine aquarium release issue because otherwise it gets lost in the mix. It gets lost in the message. And so we have worked with a number of partners here locally. We had our media launch day on Monday. If you Google Don't Let It Loose Hawaii, some of those news clips will pop up and you can see what's going on. I wanted to highlight just a few partners in that. The Waikiki Aquarium is actually an amnesty location. We have a law where it's illegal to import and possess the vast majority of marine aquarium species that are available around the world. So we theoretically are pretty good at prevention, but what we're seeing out in the environment is that we're not as good as we need to be. We know people have these things and they are releasing them purposefully, but perhaps innocently. We want to make sure people know that there is an amnesty turn-in law. Department of Agriculture runs that program. And if you have something that may be illegal, you can turn it in without fear of prosecution. You can do it by calling 643-PEST. You can deliver it to the Waikiki Aquarium if it's a marine species, or to any of the plant quarantine offices, Department of Agriculture offices across the state. So no excuse. You have an opportunity to do this. And we also wanted to send the message that the 643 PEST number, and it can also go to 643pest.org, which our partner in this webinar, Elizabeth Spieth, receives those reports. You can also provide tips. If you know of someone that has illegal species in Hawaii, you can turn that information in and we will follow up on it. We being not me, the Department of Agriculture, who has that authority, will do that. So both the carrot and the stick. We also have some other partners. So the Waikiki Aquarium has a new display with some of these species. Go on down and take a look at it. They now have their signage up that tells you it's illegal. We also have a partner at Bishop Museum, and Dr. Carlton, you have long worked with Bishop Museum. I encourage folks to go to their new website. So you can type into your search function, Bishop Museum and AIS, and it will get to a fabulous new page. And you can see graphically laid out some of the data that you helped collect, Dr. Carlton. So that's a really interesting page, as well as Division of Aquatic Resources. Our state runs the new pages, Don't Let It Loose Hawaii. And I'm going to put that into the chat. It's DONT, Let It Loose, HI.org. And that will get you to all of these resources that we talked about. I guess I got to provide the YouTube link for this video onto that page. And hopefully you can learn more there. Thanks so much for putting that in there. All right, last time for questions. Oh, I see Pat, she has a question. If people flush their aquatic species into the sewer, can some species survive the treatment process? Do you know about our sewer system, Jim?
I do not know about the sewer system in Hawaii. In general, probably not, and because of water quality and because of the filters used. However, it probably isn't just a complete fix, because some species have incredible ability to survive in some of the most obnoxious conditions, and at times sewer systems overflow, and so they have no treatment whatsoever because of storms and things like that. So probably not the best way to do it, and maybe in some cases not the most humane.
Yeah, thank you. If you are just disposing of your aquarium water, if you could potentially, I hate to say this, pour it into your grass, it will leave a little salty spot. Very sorry about that. But definitely don't dump it down your storm drain, which does not go into any sort of sewage treatment. It goes straight to the ocean. So that's a great question. Thanks so much, Pat. All right, Elizabeth has put into the chat also the link to the YouTube where you can share this with your friends for watching later on. Popcorn, beer, and maybe maybe 2 beers on that one. I want to thank you so much, Jim, for joining us, for sharing your expertise. I feel like I need a credit from Williams College for taking that class. I always learn something new when I talk with you. So just mahalo for sharing your expertise. Thanks also to the Hawaii Invasive Species Council for helping us host this. Elizabeth Spieth, you are a tech wizard and a delight to work with. Mahalo. Mahalo to all of our partners in this Don't Let It Loose campaign. We have a few more activities going on this week. If you're in town and want to see some of the amnesty program species that have been turned in, head on down to the Hawaii Department of Agriculture Plant Quarantine Office on Awiki Street. They will show you some terrestrial and hopefully some aquatic species that they have received. Thank you to everybody also for joining us. It wouldn't be a webinar without an audience. Thanks so much. All right. Thanks so much and have a great day. Aloha.
Thanks. Mahalo.